Picture a chasm so vast that no traveler has ever crossed it, a gulf fixed between two realities separated by nothing more than a whisper and everything that eternity contains. On one side, the sound of laughter and the scent of something like wine and warm bread. On the other, a thirst so absolute that a single drop of water from a stranger's fingertip becomes the most desperate prayer ever uttered. This is the story of the place the ancient Hebrews called the bosom of Abraham, and what happened to every righteous soul who died before a Galilean carpenter walked out of a tomb. You have heard the phrase your entire life, perhaps in a hymn, perhaps in a whispered comfort at a funeral, perhaps in a Sunday school lesson that raised more questions than it answered. But almost no one knows what it actually meant, where it actually was, and what actually happened to the millions of righteous men and women who waited there for something they did not fully understand. Because for roughly 4,000 years, from the death of Abel until the morning of the third day after a Roman crucifixion, the righteous dead did not go where you think they went. They went somewhere else entirely. And what happened to them on that resurrection morning is the most staggering rescue mission in the history of the universe. Consider the arithmetic first, because the arithmetic is what shatters casual assumptions. If you accept the biblical timeline, even loosely, you are looking at somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 years of human history before the resurrection. During that immense span, every prophet, every patriarch, every faithful widow, every righteous child, every believing Gentile who feared the God of Israel died and went somewhere. Moses died. Elijah was taken. Abraham was buried in the cave of Machpelah. Sarah was buried beside him. Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, all of them laid down in the same darkness. David died, and, as the Apostle Peter would later declare in Jerusalem, his tomb was still with them on the day of Pentecost. His soul was not in heaven. Peter said it plainly. David has not ascended into the heavens, so where was he? Where were they all? The Hebrew scriptures give the place a name, Sheol. The Greek translators later rendered it Hades, and the Latin rendered it Infernus, and the English translators wrestled with it for centuries, sometimes calling it hell, sometimes calling it the grave, sometimes calling it the pit. But the word itself simply meant the realm of the dead. It was not a metaphor. It was not a poetic flourish. It was a real destination, with real geography in the ancient Hebrew imagination, and every single human being who died before a specific moment in the first century went there. Everyone, the wicked and the righteous alike, but not to the same room. This is where the picture sharpens. Sheol, in the understanding preserved by the rabbis of the Second Temple period and later crystallized by the words of Jesus himself in the 16th chapter of Luke, was divided. It had two compartments, separated by that impassable chasm you were asked to picture at the very beginning. One side was a place of torment, of flames, of memory turned into agony. The other side was a place of comfort, of reunion, of waiting. And the waiting side had a name that carried the deepest meaning any Jewish listener could imagine: the bosom of Abraham. To reach that phrase and understand it, you have to reach back to the Middle Eastern dining custom of the ancient world. At a formal banquet, guests did not sit upright at rigid tables. They reclined on low couches, propped on the left elbow, feet extending outward, heads angled toward the center. The guest of highest honor at any meal reclined immediately to the right of the host, so close that his head literally rested against the host's chest. He was, in the Hebrew idiom, in the bosom of the host. It was the seat of intimacy. It was the seat of favor. It was the seat that said, of all the people in this room, you are the closest. Now scale that image to eternity. To be in the bosom of Abraham was to recline at the great banquet of the covenant, with the Father of the faithful himself as your host, your head against his chest, safe from every terror that had ever pursued you in life. It was the place of the covenant kept. It was the place of the promise honored. It was the place of the righteous dead, waiting for something that neither Abraham nor Moses nor any of them could fully name. They were waiting for a door to open, because the door was closed. This is the part that modern Christians almost universally forget, and the forgetting distorts the entire arc of redemption. Heaven, in the sense of the direct presence of God with resurrected humanity, was not open before the cross. The tabernacle in the wilderness made this visual with brutal clarity. Behind the veil, in the Holy of Holies, the presence of God dwelt above the mercy seat, and the veil was closed. Once a year, one man, the high priest, went behind that veil with blood, and only with blood, and only after elaborate preparation, and only trembling. The message of the veil was not subtle. The way into the presence was not yet open. Something had to happen first. Something enormous. Something that no bull and no goat and no lamb could ever finally accomplish. So the righteous waited. They waited in the bosom of Abraham for 4 millennia. And you have to sit with that number to feel it. 4,000 years. If you tried to count to 100 million out loud at one number per second without stopping for sleep or food or rest, it would take you more than 3 years to finish. Now imagine waiting 40 times longer than that. Imagine Adam himself, the first man, sitting in that comfort for so long that the vocabulary of every human civilization changed a dozen times over. Imagine Enoch and Noah after him, and Job and Melchizedek, all of them present, all of them aware, all of them content in the covenant but incomplete, waiting for the door. The Hebrew scriptures gave them fragments of what they were waiting for. Isaiah spoke of a suffering servant. David sang of a righteous one whose soul would not be abandoned to Sheol, whose body would not see corruption. Job, from the ash heap of his misery, cried out that he knew his Redeemer lived, and that in the latter day this Redeemer would stand upon the earth. Daniel saw a Son of Man coming with the clouds and receiving an everlasting kingdom, but none of them saw the whole picture. None of them saw exactly how the rescue would happen. They saw the shape of the door, but not the key. And the key, when it finally turned in the lock, turned on a Friday afternoon outside a city wall. Consider what Jesus told his disciples on the way to that Friday. In the 16th chapter of Matthew, he made a promise that has been read 1,000 ways but rarely with the geography in mind. He said that the gates of Hades would not prevail against his church. Gates in ancient warfare are not offensive weapons. Gates are defensive. Gates keep things in. And what he was announcing in a single sentence was that the gates that had kept the righteous dead confined for 4,000 years were about to be broken from the outside. Then on the night before he died, he told a thief crucified next to him something no rabbi had ever promised any dying man. Today you will be with me in paradise. That word paradise, in the Jewish literature of the period, was not a synonym for heaven above. It was one of the names for the comfort side of Sheol. It was the bosom of Abraham by another name. The word came from Persian, meaning a walled garden, an enclosed park of pleasure. And Jesus was telling the thief, before this sun sets, you and I will be there together, not in heaven, not yet, in paradise, in the waiting place. Because Jesus, in the 3 days between his death and his resurrection, was going somewhere specific. His body lay in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, wrapped in linen strips and roughly 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, according to the Gospel of John. But his human soul, according to a chain of biblical passages the early church stitched together with fierce care, descended. The Apostle Peter, in the 3rd chapter of his first letter, wrote that Jesus went and preached to the spirits in prison. In the 4th chapter, he added that the gospel was preached even to those who are dead. The Apostle Paul, in the 4th chapter of Ephesians, wrote that when Christ ascended on high, he led captivity captive, and that the ascent implied a prior descent into the lower parts of the earth. And Jesus himself, in the 12th chapter of Matthew, told his opponents that as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man would be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The heart of the earth. Not the tomb, because the tomb was on the surface, cut into a limestone hillside. Something deeper. The ancient Christian creeds, hammered out in councils and repeated by candlelight in catacombs, preserved this teaching in a single stark phrase. He descended into hell, not the hell of the damned, in the theology those same creeds affirmed, but the realm of the dead, the lower place, the place where the righteous still waited behind their side of the great chasm. And what happened when he arrived is the moment the entire arc of Scripture has been building toward from the 3rd chapter of Genesis. Try to picture it, because the picture is worth the effort. The comfort side of Sheol has been full for millennia. Abraham is there, and he has been the host of that banquet since before Egypt was Egypt. Moses is there and Elijah is there, though Elijah's presence in the story is complicated by the Mount of Transfiguration and by his fiery ascent, and the rabbis argued about it for generations. David is there, harp perhaps in hand, waiting for the greater son he prophesied. Every righteous soul back to Abel, murdered in a field by his own brother, is present. They have heard faintly of what was happening on the surface. Some traditions suggest that the prophets there had been given foresight of the events unfolding above, and then the door opens, not their side, not the door they had been watching. A different door, one that no one in Sheol had ever seen open before. The door on the side of the wicked, and through it comes a light that has never been in this place, not once in 4,000 years. And behind the light comes a man. He is dressed, if the visionary language of Revelation is any guide, in a robe dipped in blood. His face, according to that same book, is like the sun shining in full strength, and he walks across the impassable chasm as though it were nothing, because for him it is nothing. He walks to the comfort side. He walks to where Abraham has been reclining for the age of nations. And he speaks. The New Testament does not give you the exact words, but it gives you the outcome. Because in the 27th chapter of Matthew, in one of the most overlooked passages in the entire Bible, we are told that at the moment of Christ's death, the veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom, the earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs were opened, and the bodies of many saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Read that again. The tombs opened at the crucifixion, but the bodies did not walk out until after the resurrection. There is a gap of 3 days between the tombs cracking open and the risen saints walking into Jerusalem. And what fills that gap is what happened in Sheol. He came to preach, he came to announce, he came to declare that the price the whole system of sacrifice had only ever gestured toward had at last been paid in full. And when he ascended, on that resurrection morning, he did not ascend alone. Paul, quoting Psalm 68 in the 4th chapter of Ephesians, said that when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives. He led captivity captive. He emptied the bosom of Abraham. He took every righteous soul who had waited there since the beginning of human history, and he brought them with him into the presence of the Father, into a paradise that was no longer a walled garden of waiting, but the very throne room of the living God. The waiting was over. The door was open. The veil was torn from top to bottom, because no human hand could have reached the top, torn by the hand of God himself, signaling that the way into the presence was open forever, for the first time since the flaming sword had barred the way back to Eden in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. The theological weight of this is difficult to overstate. Consider Hebrews 11, the great chapter of the Hall of Faith. It lists Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Rahab and Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets. And at the end of that immense catalogue, the writer says something extraordinary. All these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God, having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Not made perfect apart from us. Abraham could not enter into the fullness of the promise until we, the church redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, were part of the story. He waited so long not because God was slow, but because the plan was single. There would be one people, Old Covenant faithful and New Covenant faithful, folded into one body, entering the presence together. That is the plan. That is why Abraham could not go ahead. That is why the door stayed closed until the cross opened it. And now, on this side of the resurrection, everything is different. When a righteous person dies today, they do not descend to a waiting room in the heart of the earth. Paul is unambiguous. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. He says he would rather depart and be with Christ, which is far better. There is no more waiting station. The chasm has been crossed once and for all. The gates of Hades have been broken open from the inside out. What remains of the wicked side of Sheol is, according to the 20th chapter of Revelation, still waiting for its final judgment. But the comfort side is empty. The bosom of Abraham no longer holds anyone, because Abraham himself is no longer holding court there. He is in the immediate presence of God, and every believer who has died since the resurrection has joined him. Consider the personal weight of this. If you have lost someone you loved who died in faith, they did not go to a waiting room. They went home, directly. There is no unconscious sleep, no intermediate purgation as some traditions later imagined, no dormant limbo. There is presence, there is Christ, there is the fullness that Abraham himself waited 4,000 years to enter and now enters instantly at the moment the last breath leaves the body. The theological technicality here is that the intermediate state, the period between individual death and the general resurrection of the body at the end of the age, is now spent in conscious presence with Christ. The general resurrection, when the bodies of the redeemed will be raised and glorified, is still future. But the soul, from the moment of death, is with the Lord. That is the change the cross accomplished for every believer who dies from that Friday afternoon onward. The old question then has a clear answer. Where were the righteous before Christ rose? They were in the bosom of Abraham. They were in a real place, in the comfort side of Sheol, held in the covenant faithfulness of the God who had promised he would not abandon his own to corruption. They were waiting for a door only one person in all of history could open. And on the third day, he opened it. He walked across a chasm no one else had ever crossed. He preached to spirits who had waited across dynasties and empires and famines and floods. He gathered every righteous soul from Adam onward, and he brought them with him into the presence of the Father, into the paradise that was no longer defined by waiting, but by fullness. The rabbis of the Second Temple period spoke of the resurrection as an event still to come, a hope on a distant horizon. They were right about the shape of the hope. They were wrong about how it would arrive. They expected a warrior. They received a lamb. They expected a throne first and a cross later. They received a cross first and a throne after. They expected the door to be opened by an army. It was opened by a solitary man, carrying his own execution instrument up a hill outside the city wall. Consider the ancient tomb complex at Beit Sherim, discovered in the 20th century in northern Israel, where thousands of Jewish burials from the 2nd and 3rd centuries were catalogued by archaeologists. Some of the inscriptions there refer to the deceased as having entered into peace, into rest, into the company of the fathers. The vocabulary of the bosom of Abraham had survived, embedded in stone, long after the Second Temple itself had fallen. It was not an invention of the parable in Luke 16. It was the common Jewish understanding of what happened to the righteous dead. And Jesus was drawing on a picture his audience already knew, precisely so that the shift he was about to accomplish would be unmistakable. The church fathers of the first 4 centuries wrote about this descent with a specificity modern Christians have almost entirely lost. Ignatius of Antioch, writing before the year 110, referred to Christ raising the prophets who were his disciples in spirit. Melito of Sardis, in a Passover sermon from around the year 170, portrayed Christ addressing Adam directly in the underworld and lifting him up. The Gospel of Nicodemus, though later and apocryphal, preserved the ancient Christian instinct that something dramatic and specific happened in the interval between the crucifixion and the resurrection. They knew that the 3 days were not empty. They knew that the descent was a rescue, and the rescue redefined every previous understanding of what it meant to die in faith. There is a specific detail worth pausing on, because it captures the whole reversal in a single image. Before the cross, when a righteous Jew died, the ritual mourning was extended and severe. There was tearing of garments, sitting on the ground for 7 days, refusal of comfort. The reason was not doubt about the covenant. The reason was that death, even for the righteous, was still an exile. The person had gone to Sheol. They were in comfort, yes, but they were absent from the surface world, and more importantly, they were still not in the presence of the Most High. The mourning acknowledged the ache of that absence. After the cross, the mourning of the church for its dead changed shape. It did not disappear. Grief is grief, and the New Testament does not sanitize it. Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus, though he knew Lazarus would rise again within the hour. But the character of Christian grief shifted. Paul told the Thessalonians to grieve, but not as those who have no hope. The dead in Christ are with Christ. The absence is real, but the destination is no longer a waiting room in the heart of the earth. It is the presence of the risen Lord. That shift is the fingerprint of the resurrection on human sorrow. For 4,000 years, righteous humanity mourned its dead into Sheol. For 2,000 years since, righteous humanity has mourned its dead into the presence of Christ. The chasm between those 2 ways of grieving is as vast as the chasm Jesus crossed on that Saturday between death and resurrection. And if you stand back and look at the whole arc, from the first murmur of promise in the 3rd chapter of Genesis to the empty tomb outside Jerusalem, what you see is not a religion, but a rescue. You see a God who made a covenant, who kept the covenant across millennia of human failure, who preserved a people through slavery and exile and captivity, who spoke through prophets who often died without seeing what they announced, who finally became flesh in an obscure Roman province, who lived a life more compressed with meaning than any other life in history, who died an execution reserved for the worst criminals, and who then, in the darkness of the 3rd day, went personally to gather every soul who had waited faithfully for him, every soul, not one left behind. The bosom of Abraham stands today as an empty room in the geography of the afterlife, a memorial to a phase of the plan that has passed. The waiting is finished. The door is open. The chasm still exists, but its crossing has been accomplished, and every believer who dies now walks through the door that a bloodied Galilean carpenter tore open with his own hands. The final word belongs to the writer of Hebrews in the 12th chapter. He tells his readers that they have come in the fellowship of the church to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, the spirits of just men made perfect. That is Abraham now, that is Moses, that is David, that is every righteous soul from Abel onward, made perfect at last, because the door is open and the presence is theirs. They waited 4,000 years to hear the sound of that door opening, and when it opened, the one who opened it did not wait for them to come out. He went in. He went down into the depth of their waiting, and he brought them home in his own train. On the morning the tomb was empty, and the sun rose over a city that would never again mean the same thing to human history. That is where the righteous were, and that is where the righteous are now. The bosom that once held them has been exchanged for the presence of the one whom Abraham himself had trusted, sight unseen, since the day he left Ur of the Chaldeans and started walking toward a promise he would only truly enter on the morning a stone rolled away outside Jerusalem.